Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin,
I'm Charlene.
and this is our new series, which is a book review that we will do each month. This time, starting with The Witcher. This should come out ahead of season 2's Netflix series.
I think it's coming up really fast.
Yeah, soon, very soon it'll drop. For those that don't know, right, and I'm assuming most people who watch this have heard of The Witcher, but those that haven't, The Witcher is set in a fantasy world, a kind of Slavic fantasy world created by Andrzej Sapkowski, the author, a Polish author. The Witcher is a kind of human hybrid that through magic has been transformed from a human into this monster hunter. So he's been part kind of monster himself. He can use certain types of magic and potions. He's a great fighter with a sword. Has a silver sword because silver is a bane for most monsters. And he goes around as a mercenary for hire, killing off other monsters for the local barons and lords and castellans and things like that. So that's the basic premise of the story. It's this high fantasy world. High fantasy can be distinguished by the fact that there is a lot of magic, a lot of magical creatures. A lot
they
of
can't coexist one another. There's humans, and then there's monsters.
Yes, exactly. They're everywhere. Whereas like a low fantasy would be like Game of Thrones,
Harry Potter.
Well, no, Harry Potter would be high fantasy in the sense that there is a lot of magic. The whole theme is magic. Right. But low fantasy as well, in the sense that it is superimposed upon the normal modern day, right? Sure. So there are the so-called muggles. Whereas low fantasy in the genre would be like things are mostly as they are, but with a little bit of supernatural kind of washed in there. And I would put Game of Thrones as the flagship of that. Most of the stories, most of the characters you could associate with, it's a fantasy world, but they're not, it's not some great wizard from some far off land casting giant spells. It's ordinary people interacting with each other. And then there are some priests and priestesses, there are religions, there are certain forms of spells and magic, but they are kind of eased into the story, sort of woven in within a limited space. It's not about the magic. Like you could have Game of Thrones without the dragons and without the spells, and it would still be Game of Thrones. Whereas high fantasy, it'd be hard to imagine like Lord of the Rings without elves and goblins and orcs and
that's true, because there's nothing left after that.
Exactly. So the Witcher is much more on the higher fantasy spectrum. It's got the elves, it's got the vampires, it's got all that kind of stuff. And the Witcher is the protagonist of the story. So we have just recently finished the book. I had played Witcher 3, the game. I had watched season 1 of The Witcher, and then I read the book as number 3. Charlene, you...
I've read the book, and I think I've watched Yennefer Turns Beautiful, and that's it.
Right.
So, yeah. But it's good. I think we have different perspectives, and we are to, contrast between the book and the series and the video game. So...
So the reason we're doing these series on literature, first of all, we want to emphasize Baltic literature and Polish and Central Europe, elevate that, on the world stage. But also, I'm a strong believer that it is sort of Central, Northern, Eastern Europe that is the real flagship carrier of Western literature today. And just before we did this filming, I showed Charlene another YouTube video. I'll leave a link in the description below on the Bloody Baron storyline from The Witcher 3, the most famous storyline, perhaps in any computer game in modern age, interviewing the Polish authors who also wrote that. So Andrzej Sapkowski is the Polish author who invented The Witcher, but that game also relies on Polish writers. So very important that it's still rooted in that Slavic tradition. And so for those that have played the Witcher 3 video game and you know what I'm talking about, I'll leave a link down below. But that was kind of just elucidating how much more complex and interesting the characters are when written by people from Central and Eastern Europe as they are from, frankly, people in the United States or Australia. Like the Bloody Baron, for example, he's an overweight white man, right? Which is all that anyone would care about.
Pretty much.
If it was written in the United States in 21st century America. Whereas, you listen to the authors who wrote the actual character, and they were peeling back layer after layer, both in terms of himself, the war that he had with his own heart, and then the allegory it had for their main protagonist, Geralt, and how they're both fathers in their own way, wildly different characters, and both presenting like a different perspective on that same role.
I did like the point in that particular video of how she one of the writers highlighted that she doesn't like making likable characters. She wants interesting characters.
Yes.
And they looked at each angle and the relationships and how you peel back the layers and layers, and you like them and you don't like them, and then you're like this, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm conflicting with my own ideals of what this character's meant to be. Because normally how you story write is like, oh, this character's the protagonist, this one's the enemy, and then you have all the different tropes underneath, right? But no, like they made this person's human, and to be human you have to have good qualities and bad qualities. No one's born evil. And then it was good explanation in that video. So
100%. And I would disagree with her phrasing there in that video where she says, likable versus interesting. I think interesting characters are inherently likable. The unlikable characters are the ones that are too perfect, that don't seem to have any flaws, that are, don't go through any story arc. They're intrinsically unlikable. And when you see politicians in the real world that try and present as if they are perfect, well, they come across as fake. And in fact, to that author's credit, she did say that she doesn't like people who smile too much and are too cheerful. It's not trustworthy, and it isn't trustworthy when people are constantly presenting their Facebook kind of facade.
That's true.
They're also, I mean, I think about the truly great characters in history, and Game of Thrones is thrown up here. We will get into The Witcher eventually, but in the first episode of Game of Thrones, and then also, of course, the first book, but in the first episode of Game of Thrones, a 10-year-old boy is pushed out of a window by Jaime Lannister because he gets caught having sex with his sister, right? An extraordinary moment of television, right? You wouldn't get this normally. And yet, through the course of several seasons, you go from thinking that Jaime Lannister is the absolute villain, right, to seeing him as incredibly complex, peeling back his layers, seeing how he got to where he did, the forces and influences that help shape him, and his arc of where he goes in his partial redemption story, where by the end of the series, you see him as a hero. You see him as a great character. In fact, he's probably my favorite character in the whole show. But there is a limit to his redemption. Like he goes off, with Brienne of Tarth, but then comes back to his sister at the end because he's always tied to her. So there's this fantastic complexity around this character. Whereas it's very hard in just modern filmmaking, where everything's done by committee, where everything has to be one-dimensional, to see that level of storytelling. Which brings us to The Witcher. So The Witcher kind of blew up, I think, by accident, and actually riding the
not by the song.
Well, that too. We will get to that.
Okay.
But The Witcher got turned into a television show, I think, on the back of Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones had concluded in a very disappointing way, but for a while there it was the biggest thing in the world. And it really took the kind of Dungeons and Dragons, nerdy sort of fantasy world that everyone kind of looked down on the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Mainstream.
Into the yeah, exactly. Yeah. Where everyone was like, holy crap, this is really cool. Okay. Yeah. And they see a Game of Thrones, and so they're like, what else is there that we can use? And they picked up The Witcher and like, okay, let's make that. But it's worth looking at The Witcher in its own light.
Yeah. Controversial admission is I've never seen Game of Thrones. Whoops! So Steve, maybe that could be the next thing. But let's go into The Witcher, who we're here for. So, Geralt. He's an interesting character. So I can... Going into this...
Geralt is the Witcher, the main protagonist.
Yeah, the main protagonist. And we read The Last Wish, which was the first book, and it goes into a series of short stories that kind of follows Geralt's journey. And it's interesting, his character. I kind of wanted to learn more about his backstory, per se, in the book, because we don't really get much of that. Like, he's motivated to hunt monsters and, for money, and that's about it. Yeah, but interesting in a way that he had, some observations of the world. Was there anything that stood out to you about Geralt's character that
Yeah, I mean, there are the I think you've elucidated a few good points. There are positives and negatives about the character. And when I say that, I mean as written, not in terms as an individual. As written, the first positive is that he's a strong, silent type character who's, like the warrior type, but is also a good protagonist in that normally you don't have that kind of character as the first person or the main character of the story. You see them more as NPCs that come in and out of the story because they don't seem to have much internal dialogue going on because they're not interacting a lot.
Yeah.
Whereas Geralt, I think, is he does have a lot of insight. He does spend a lot of time straddling different worlds, as like part human, part something else, not really accepted by either, drifting from place to place and yet taking in a lot of things.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the author's great strengths is to be able to portray that and convey that to a reader in a very convincing way. So he's not like a boring character. Like I feel like I'm reading him and that I'm actually invested in like what he's doing. So that's good.
Yeah, it's really interesting how he hunts for monsters, but you would think that like, would he have that tie with himself? Like, I actually am a monster too, like in a way? Or does he think it's like the other monster is an other to me, but really like...
Yes. I mean, he
does he feel more
befriends Novellen, that kind of human with the pig's face.
Yeah.
Who's also a bit like him in the sense that he's part human and part something else. And Geralt sees through that immediately. So, and you sort of contrast him as a parallel with Geralt himself, that Geralt doesn't lean into the monstrous aspect of himself except to fight other monsters. Most of the time, he is a man, right? Like basically, and he judges himself by the behaviors of men. And yet... he does have a certain superiority over most men. Like killing a witcher is a great achievement for a knight. Because he's a superior in strength and speed and senses and has certain magics and signs and things like that. So he's a cut above. Okay.
Yeah.
And yet he doesn't really judge himself by that. He's much more
because it's such
grounded.
cut above. What happened to the other witches? Because they don't really go into that. They said there's fewer and fewer witches.
Well, this is because now... so this is a really great theme that you've touched on. And one of the great themes of the story is change in the world. And they go on through this throughout the book. And I think this is probably the most impressive aspect of the book, but we'll get into that in some detail. The number of witches is decreasing because it takes magic to turn boys into witches. They go through some terrible trials. Few of them survive. Most of them perish through these kinds of experiments and changes. But those that survive do become these great witches. The book talks about how there are fewer and fewer monsters. And Geralt talks about this, how it's becoming increasingly difficult to find work. And Dandelion, who's his main friend in the story, and we'll go into the story of Dandelion as well, but he's kind of like, oh, look, you can find work anywhere. There's monsters everywhere. And Geralt says, well, no, not only are there fewer and fewer monsters, but attitudes towards monsters are changing because they're not threatening in the same way as they once were, because mankind is sort of taking over everything. Monsters are becoming almost a bit of a curiosity. And he gives like a bunch of examples. The one I like is about the troll, how there's this troll who's breaking people's legs when they cross a bridge and don't pay the toll. And so he goes up to the local castellan and says, how much for the troll? And the guy says, what? No, you have to leave the troll there. He repairs the bridge. It costs less to pay the toll than it would be for us to repair the bridge. We kind of like the troll there. But this gets that. Actually, I'll bring up that story again as one of the negative things, because there's something about that I don't like as well, which I'll come back to. Yeah, so he's talking about how there are fewer and fewer monsters, and the monsters are now being started to perceive as normal flora and fauna in the world.
Well, they're cohabitating with one another, right?
Yeah, well, some have to. I mean, the elves, for example. There are elves that are resisting the march of human civilization, and then there are elves that are seeking to integrate. And what that indicates is that like a number of elves have lost their traditional elvish roots. They're no longer living their spiritual ways, and they're integrating with humankind of all stratas of the society as well. Like a lot of them are ending up as criminals and things like that as well. They're developing all human vice. I find that a very powerful part of the story, that Geralt is seeing the writing on the wall for witches. He's seeing the writing on the wall for monsters. What he's saying is he's seeing the writing on the wall for magic, right? Early in the book, it's implied that, or at least to my reading, I'll have to go back and have a look, but it is implied that mankind were flourishing, and then there was some kind of celestial event or something that brought all the monsters and magic and stuff into the world. Okay?
Yeah.
But later on, in the Edge of the World book, where the elves are being pushed off, they're talking about how this was all their natural world. Like, once upon a time, all the monsters and elves and everything, they lived in abundance.
Yeah.
And it was mankind that came along and pushed them out. Okay? And I find this to be quite analogous to
real life.
Real life, yeah. Yeah, and
indigenous cultures are pushed out.
That too. I wasn't thinking. I'm sure that's true, indigenous cultures, but I was thinking just in terms of the there be monsters kind of mentality. Like, so one of the things about the book that really struck out me is it read like a series of folk tales. So on the one hand, it's a series of short stories, but if you think of Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf and like all of these sorts of things that we hear about as children, the Grimm's fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel, all of that stuff. Well, there's a lot of that in The Witcher, right? There's a lot of superstition and a lot of prophecy and destiny and magical things happening and a lot of royalty, and it feels very grounded in old story. And one of the things that comes through is that that sense that there is a world of mystery out there, that there is dragons and monsters and trolls and things, that is no longer the case as humans take over the world.
Right, yeah.
And here in Australia, for example, we have this massive landmass, some places where no one's ever been. Right, like it's a huge continent relative to the population, and yet most of us live in very urbanized cities, and it doesn't feel like we're anything other than conquerors, right?
Sure.
But if you go to like a place like Tasmania, which I think is underpopulated relative to its environment because of all the rivers and mountains and so on, it does feel like the wilderness is still kind of in control and that we're kind of pioneering our way through it. And so stories of monsters has a certain feeling of truth. And when you talk about like Bigfoot in America and so on, well, in Australia, it's the Tasmanian tiger, which actually really existed, right? And you can see a film of it. It's a real creature, but there's constant sightings of this creature that is now extinct or thought to be extinct because people go off into those wild areas and they claim to see things that we don't think are still with us. So The Witcher goes into that in a great depth.
Yeah, it's funny to, I guess, contrast the elves with Geralt, because Geralt's kind of found his way into integrate in, I guess, this society of monsters and humans. And he does Geralt, speaking to his best friend. What's his best friend's name?
Dandelion.
Dandelion, yes, Dandelion, like the flower. Dandelion. Always bright and happy, but it gives you pollen. No. So, he talks to Dandelion how there's like less work, and Dandelion points out, even though he's funny, he's actually very wise of explaining. It's like, it's a bit ironic how you hunt all these monsters, and if there's no monsters left, well, you kind of left, without a job. But that's okay. Like, you just switch roles. If no one needed a flute performer, I'll just become a gardener. So it's interesting in that way of, I always thought to myself, if he did lose his role as a witcher, being high above society, would he also become bitter against the humans?
Well, so much of this is comparing Geralt as someone who's kind of an outsider with different parallels. So Nivellen, the guy with the pig's head who's cursed, he's found a role for himself. He invites people over to stay with him, and he hands out cash to their fathers, and he's quite happy as the monster, right? And then he's surprised to be turned back into a human. Whereas Geralt, he's accepts that he is a Witcher and probably feels like there's something missing, but can't really articulate it well. But he's integrated with human society, and he says that he doesn't really want to be out in the wild too much. Like when they go off to the edge of the world, and Dandelion's like, "Oh, there's all these monsters out in the edge of the world that you can go and fight." He's like, "Yes, but no one to pay me," So he likes being part of urban life, which is kind of strange. Like you're not, it's sort of counterintuitive. But then when you meet the elves that are super angry and they're trying to fight their way back and push back against the civilization, even when the villagers, the thing about the villagers is they're not bad people. They're growing cool stuff. They're quite happy to do what this ancient spirit tells them to do, which is not kill anything.
Yeah.
And they seem harmless.
They said to drive the elves away, right? They didn't say to kill the elf.
Yeah, no, not at all. They actually said it. And it was even a devil at the time. They called it a devil. Like, no, you're not allowed to kill the devil. You can just send it away.
Just send it away. It's stealing stuff.
And so it's really interesting that the humans are not portrayed as villainous. Okay. No. And if you think about the kind of political dimension you could get from this kind of story where, you've got the invaders like taking all of the land, turning it into their own, develop their own purposes, their own produce, and pushing the indigenous into the hills, corner, right? Yeah. Very much like American colonization and sort of type thing where they're pushing all the Indians onto the reservation and so forth, signing all these unequal treaties. That's not the political message. The message is that these people are just trying to live, and they're struggling with a lot of the problems that other people are struggling with.
It's really interesting how this, now reflecting on it, the Witcher's stories aren't like a typical good versus evil in every story. Like there's good and evil in every character actually, when you're like, and you kind of like have to question your own morality. Is like, yes, they're driving the elves into the mountains, but the elves are also stealing their produce and didn't want to integrate where other monsters are integrating. But is it right for monsters to integrate with the humans? Like, have they got liberty? It's
the thing about the elf story is that they had themselves abandoned their own ways. So they are blaming humans for the encroachment on their land, their hunger and starvation and whatnot. But then they're willing to murder Dandelion and Geralt in cold blood, right? Because of their Machiavellian goals. And then the Eternal One shows up who's like, you're not supposed to do that. It doesn't say that. There's like no words are spoken, but you get that sense. And it's clear that the elves themselves have given up already those things that made them special. Clearly, once upon a time, they lived in accordance with nature, and they gave that up out of vengeance against the human race, essentially. So, and Geralt is there. You're like, one day you're going to come down from the mountains to die gloriously, and I'll be there waiting. And so there is a sort of sad prophetic moment where Geralt has chosen a side, but his side is life, integration, peace, making the way, and the Eternal One sides with the villagers, which is really interesting. You think an ancient spirit that had been there forever would side with the native kind of elves and things like that and try and fight to push these things away. But no, they're like, look, these are just people. They're trying to live.
Yeah, but how come the elders haven't come down the mountains?
Because they don't want to integrate. So some elves do integrate.
Yeah.
And the other elves are saying, no, we want to maintain our own, our own territory, our own ways.
Sure.
And when their villagers are asked about this, they said, we don't really interact with them. We just keep to ourselves. So they barely recognize that the elves even exist. They know that they're out there somewhere, but they don't have any animosity towards them. And if there's a sort of implication that if they knew the elves were starving and that the elves needed help, the villagers would probably provide some assistance. It's just that the elves don't want their charity. They want, to fight their kind of battle. And so I just find that a really challenging arc, and there's a conversation between Geralt and the elves that I won't read out here, but is very, very powerful, talking about the nature of resentment, anger, and the different approaches. Like Geralt himself has a lot of reason to be angry with the human race. Like, he's treated as an outsider. He's constantly being, threatened
and pummeled with stones, and
no matter what he does for people, like they're totally ungrateful. And so
it's kind of interesting, like how, like, again, like the changing landscape, how these elves have like really grasped onto history. But that was, I think they did talk about the story of how when like the elves were the ones across the world and the humans came and they shared their magic with them and they tried to cohabitate, and then they saw that humans were taking over the world. They became resentful, and then in generations past they still hold on to that resentment, but it's changed. Like it's kind of like analogous to nowadays of like people really gripping onto these statues that things have changed and progressed on. And do you choose life or do you choose resentment? Like,
that's true. I don't want to make it too analogous of the modern day, but there is, a question mark over when you do want to resist changes and when you want to support changes, because change is inevitable.
Sure.
But not all changes are beyond one's control. Like the fact that change itself must happen does not mean that all changes that do happen are positive or are beyond the control of the protagonists. But that's a whole other kind of philosophical debate. I guess, what about the role of like destiny and magic and providence in the story? Because this is something that I find really powerful in The Witcher, where so much is tied up with prophecy. And if you read like ancient historians here in the real world, like Herodotus, he gives causal explanations for events by saying, there was a prophecy that, such and such would happen, and these things happened to fulfill the prophecy, or the gods were angered by such and such as, sacrilege, and they were punished in this way. And it wasn't really until Thucydides where that kind of got washed away, and people focused on, the very human aspects of why things happen in the world. Well, The Witcher really introduces those things, that so much happens because destiny wills it. So what did you find, like, reading the book, about like the role of things that were kind of supernatural or providential in terms of driving the story forward?
For reading the book, I hadn't actually watched the series, so I found it really difficult to understand the rules of the world and what the Witcher world kind of looked like. So the fact that they still believed in magic and like they kind of coexisted, I was like, really? Because they can control the magic, right? But they still relied on like the whole destiny part. The Law of Surprise was an interesting story. It's almost like karma that they kind of say, like when you save somebody, they're like, okay, instead of just saying, I want your horse, they're like, oh, I'll take whatever is unexpected from you. Like, how do they even trust that person to be like, okay, yeah, sure, let's do that? I don't know, I really struggled with it, because nowadays you don't really think of that. There's no surprises. It's kind of like fact or fiction. And no one really focuses on destiny until you lose all hope and you're like, okay, just hope, like you just suddenly want to believe everything. Right?
Yes. I would say that the role of providence, let's put it that way, is twofold in The Witcher. The first is, it's one of the things that binds the feudal society together. So when the story of, and I can't remember the name of the story, but the one where the queen has hired Geralt as a guardian of her daughter, effectively coming out to be married to someone from Skellige. But instead, someone shows up and says, no, she's mine because her father promised me under the law of surprise 15 years before.
Sure.
And she knew that he was cursed and that he would like be a monster between certain hours. And she wanted the Witcher effectively to kill him. Is the sort of the
Yeah.
show of it. So she didn't want to fulfill the law of surprise. Two things about that. One, there was an inevitability to that whole story from the beginning. She was saying, look, there is one thing I can't resist, which is destiny. I.e., the witch is like, why do you need me? You're the queen. You can kill whoever, right?
Yeah.
And she's like, well, there's one thing I'm going to struggle with, which is destiny. And destiny shows up. And there is there is a sense that it's already being fulfilled. Also, there is a moral authority to this, which doesn't exist in the real world. So he shows up and says, I'm here to marry your daughter, the princess, because
your father or your husband promised me.
Made an oath
that
I would get under the law of surprise, and it turned out to be this daughter that he didn't know he had. Now, when the queen is talking about this, there are several things that are revealed. The first is that she only finds out about it on her husband's deathbed, because her husband had kept it from her, knowing how angry she would be that the daughter had been promised to somebody else, right? That, as part of some kind of oath.
Right.
And she was very upset that she ever found out. Okay. Secondly, she's
Would
like...
it all fall apart if he never told her? Would destiny still work?
Well, I mean, but this... Well, actually, no, what you've asked is a really powerful question. It all works because people believe it works.
Yeah.
And when one of the nobles trying to sort through this... Because the queen stands up and says, look, I don't care what my late husband said to some boy 15 years ago under duress, etc., etc. I'm not fulfilling any damn promise for my daughter when, this doesn't exist as free will. And the nobles are like, well, hang on. And these are the nobles from our own kingdom, not the ones that are angry because they're suitors from other places.
Yeah.
But one from our own kingdom is like, hang on. The whole thing is tied together through promise. Right? The relationship between the queen and the nobles and the renters on the land. Like, it's all by oath and word and bond.
Sure.
And so if a promise is made by a monarch as an oath and everybody knows it, if the queen sets it aside, what does that say for the whole superstructure of the feudal
Right. So it sets a precedent for everything else to come forward.
Why should the nobles obey their oaths if the queen doesn't honour the oath of a king?
Sure.
Right. So it's that he brings this up. He's like, look, the reason you give the daughter away is to preserve the kingdom, not because you think it's going to hurt the kingdom. She wants to make an alliance with Skellige because she thinks Skellige is this powerful kingdom, and we don't really know in the books like the political relationships between the different players, but this is what we're told. And yet the nobles are saying actually there's a higher risk that you lose the support of your own people. Okay. And the ace that's up the queen's sleeves is that she knows that this guy is cursed, and that if he's revealed before midnight, then everyone will see as a monster, and that will change the game a bit. But there's all this like mysticism tied up with one's word and one's oath, and I think that's kind of emblematic of history as well, that you get someone to make an oath and your word is so much more important than it is today. So if you go to someone and say, look, I'll meet you out clubbing at this time on Friday, and then the time comes around and you're like, no, I don't really feel like I'm not going to go. Well, that creates an issue, but it's not like the end of the world, right? Whereas, like, you go back in ages past, you could be executed for something like that. It would be like,
really?
Well, no, I mean, because your value depends upon your commitment, right? And so, and particularly if you're a certain social class, it's critical. You can't just commit to something and then not follow through on that commitment unless there's a very good reason. That would be generally accepted within that group. So destiny and providence has a certain mystical importance in the series, which I quite liked. And also the law of surprise, although it's got some problems if you really think it through and how it would work in practice.
Yeah, like you need to understand. Well, firstly, you need to rely on there's going to be a surprise because it could just be like, oh, here's a new door in my castle. Like that's yours.
Well, they actually talk about that in the book. That sometimes it's a puppy, sometimes it's a plant. Like some, things can happen which are not
significant. As a baby, like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But it's also, I mean, putting that aside, it's believed that creates a destiny bond, that you've committed to something that you don't know, and they've accepted something that they don't know.
Yeah.
Which means that there is a third mystical party that has to get involved, called destiny, that decides what that thing is. Okay, so if you end up with a plant, it's because you were meant to have that plant, right? And there's a reason why you've got that plant. And so you should take care of that plant and do something with it because it's going to be important later, right, for your personal path. Right. So there is a belief that there is a magical thing that's created through these things. And it's an extension of the feudal bonds that existed between people. Now, I just found that to be very interesting as an idea. I don't think it's taken to its conclusion in the way that perhaps it needs to, which leads me, I guess, to
it keeps them like a moral compass, I guess, because if they didn't have destiny, who would they be like responsible to?
Well, that's right. They do have, of course, religion in the book. So interspersed between these historical little short stories is Geralt with the priestess, and they're of this hospital, I guess to say, or a place called of Melite or something like that, Melitele, which is a goddess. So they do have religion, but it's not necessarily universal. Like there does seem to be a sort of polytheistic kind of world. So there's not a universal doctrine that everyone adheres to.
Sure.
So it is these kind of feudal bonds. But with all that said, maybe move on to, I guess, some criticisms of the series. What would be the number one thing that you didn't like about the book?
Didn't like about the book. Well, one thing I just pointed out, because I only just started watching the Witcher series, and I didn't like. Well, I think the Witcher series did really well. Was
the Netflix series, television?
Yeah, the Netflix series, the Striga storyline.
Mm-hmm.
So in the book, they just kind of have a full exposition. He has a conversation with the guy and be like, "You should go to this place because I heard all these rumors that like." The king slept with his sister and all these kind of things. So you get like the full shebang. Whereas in the Netflix series, The Witcher, it kind of gets slowly dripped and you kind of like learn bit by bit, like why is he so reluctant to engage with the Witcher? The Witcher is really trying to find out more information.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found that just much better storytelling. Because there's more anticipation. You're like, oh, there's actually shame associated with sleeping with your sister. Whereas I don't feel like they had that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dandelion's character was better executed in the Netflix series than in the book. The only thing I liked was their conversation they had about the lack of monsters, and he kind of like was like, "I'm your best friend, and here's the deal." Like.
Yeah, that's interesting. I struggle a bit with Dandelion. So in the book, it's called Dandelion. Now I looked into this because I was surprised when I saw this series. I'm like, why would you call it Jaskier? Is Dandelion in the game? Is Dandelion in the books? What's with this renaming? Apparently, the original name of Dandelion was Jaskier, the Polish name.
Oh, did they change it?
And they changed it with the American release, and then it kind of just took over. So Dandelion was not the original name as originally conceived. And so it was a kind of return tradition. So I think that's fair. I like that. The thing about Dandelion in the books and the game, he is flighty and he's kind of all this, but he does have like a serious intelligence. All right, like he does say things to Geralt that are quite interesting. Right, he has his own. He is the master of his own story. Whereas I did find in the series that Jaskier, although I liked him and I think it was great, was a bit of a sidekick of Geralt.
Right.
and a bit of a hanger-on. Like he just sort of shows up with Geralt and kind of starts following him around whether Geralt likes it or not. And there are times in the series, and you'll see it later, where Geralt blows up at Jaskier. Like Jaskier like does something that pisses him off and he loses his cool. Whereas in the book, it's clear that they have a deep relationship. They really like each other. But they don't really explain why. Like,
they're like opposites attract, and that was pretty much the explanation.
I didn't really get it either. Like, because Geralt has a very lone wolf. He's even got the wolf medallion persona.
Sure.
That it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a really close friendship, like a Hercules and a Iolaus kind of character. Like he doesn't seem to be that type of guy.
And so then lute player.
Exactly. Like, what does Dandelion see in Geralt, and what does Geralt see in Dandelion? And that's never made clear. I like them both as individuals, but their relationship doesn't strike me as compelling because we can't see what that connection is based on.
Well, I think, in human nature, like, I feel like you're attracted to things that you feel like you have a void in your life. Like if Geralt feels like he has a void of like joy and like eccentricness, he's like, that's why Dandelion's like, I need more serious and someone to protect me. Oh, please, Geralt, help me, save me from these bullies. Because like he sleeps with somebody, and that's how they meet. So sleep with somebody's sister who had 3 big brothers hunting for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, he's a comic relief kind of aspect to him. But I do think that was a weakness of the story, that relationship isn't properly developed. You're told that they like each other. They interact as if they do like each other. Yeah. You're not shown that they like each other. That's not persuasive. What about Yennefer?
Yennefer. Interesting character. I guess we hear bits and pieces, but we don't really get to her until the last wish. And then she just comes across as really crazy. Just a little bit. Like, the fight scenes are pretty intense, and she seems so obsessed. What was it? Like, the genie's, like, the cap of the genie or something. And you're just like, why is that? But then you mentioned, right, and I couldn't get it out of my head, was just how you compared Yennefer's hotness. I don't get it. I guess it's a masculine thing, but I'm just like, but she's so hot in the video game, and she's not that hot in the series.
Well, this is something that the books made me feel better about. Okay, so I mean, now that Charlene has outed me in this way, I struggled with the character of Yennefer because when the series came out, all I could hear from all the reviews and everything about the television series was how great Yennefer was and how great an actress she was. And I was thinking, like, I just wasn't that impressed. And it's not just because she wasn't attractive, but just because she didn't strike me as the kind of, all-powerful sort of being. She seemed like going through the motions. At least that's how I perceived it. Now, this is one of the rare moments in history where my perspective has changed. I wasn't sold on her. She wasn't my favorite character in the television show, but now that's all been turned on its head because I was comparing her with the video game. In the video game, Yennefer is a very, like, out there personality, and she's very like in her own sort of thing, doing her own thing, and Geralt has to kind of follow and catch up. And he's sort of like constantly chasing after her, and she's kind of allowing him in when it's convenient, sort of thing. And so I could see the appeal, right? I couldn't see Geralt's appeal for Yennefer in the television show. He like, in part because Henry Cavill, and Henry Cavill's obviously
Henry Cavill
is obviously someone that like is probably even hotter in real life than Geralt is, right? So, and then Yennefer really didn't seem to be that attractive by comparison, right? Let's be real. I liked Yennefer in the show as the Hunchback. I found her storyline as the Hunchback, and when she was the Hunchback, really loved it. And then when she was beautified, I almost found her more attractive as a Hunchback, right? I was like, I don't like this. I think there's something wrong.
But why did you like her as a Hunchback?
Well, because she seemed more authentic as a Hunchback. When I saw her as an attractive woman, A, she didn't strike me as that attractive, and B, she looked like someone who should really be a Hunchback, right? Like, I was looking at her being like, she doesn't look right. Now, this is why it all changed for me. I read the book,
Yeah.
And the Yennefer in the book is so much more like Yennefer on the screen. And that connection between the book and the television show was transformative for my appreciation for the on-show actress. So in the book, it's expressed explicitly. She doesn't look right. It's clear that because they go into who sorcerers are.
Yeah.
And they say, look, a sorceress is not usually born of the attractive stock because an attractive young woman who's a sorceress typically is highborn, and they're much more valuable as married partners. Like no father in their right mind is going to send her off to some sorcery school when he could have a productive marriage and build his power. So it doesn't, like in the context of the world, the sorcerers are almost all born ugly or unable to be married for some reason. Yeah. And then magic makes them attractive. Like they make them attractive so they can be consorts to various people.
Yeah.
And so they're all corrected. And Geralt, with his Witcher senses, is trying to work out when he sees Yennefer. He's like, look, there's something not right about her. It's clear that she's been corrected, but he's trying to figure out what it is.
Yeah, like had the sorry, I took it right. The anger of the hunchback.
Exactly. Yeah. So eventually Geralt works it out. And through what I think is fairly consistent writing, like he kind of is revealed in a understandable way. And in the television show, they go into her backstory, which they don't in the first book of The Witcher. And you get the whole backstory of her being a hunchback and then becoming so. And then when you finally see her as the corrected version of the hunchback, she's not like the most beautiful woman who's ever lived, although they kind of portray that in the show as if she is, which I think is still a mistake of the show. They should have just gone with it more naturally.
Sure.
I think when I see her now, I'm like, you're not a beautiful woman. You are still a hunchback. Yeah. You're a hunchback that has been portrayed as a beautiful woman. Yeah. And when you see the trade-off for Yennefer, which makes a really compelling character, is to become a powerful sorceress, she has to give up the ability to have children. Right? Yeah. And in the show, that is a much more explicit and powerful kind of thing where she goes through that choice.
Yeah, and like they contrast it with this, because I love the fact that they like lined up the stories. So they lined up Yennefer's development and they lined up the Striga's hunting, and they both do the scream, and I was like, what is this? Like it just intensifies everything of like all this like sacrifice and choice and like, yeah.
Whereas in the book, they do it, I think, in the wrong order. Because they do it right, because what you've described there in the show is correct. In the book, they kind of reveal that Yennefer wants a child before you even meet Yennefer. So that it's a conversation that happens between Geralt and the priestess, right? When Geralt's like knows that that's what Yennefer wants, and that's revealed, and you're like, okay, well, she's made. You kind of learn that she's made this sacrifice to become a sorceress, and now she's unhappy with that. She wants to be able to have children as well, and. In the show, it's made more kind of obvious that that's why she wants the genie, because it's one of the pathways she thinks is going to allow her to have children. What's not really revealed in either case is why she wants children so bad. I guess perhaps it could be a Slavic thing that it's just presupposed that she's a woman, she'll want a child. But it's not like I think in both the book and the show, it would be better if the relationship with Geralt had evolved to the point where Yennefer wanting to have a child was a natural consequence of that she needed to have that as like a living, breathing embodiment of their connection. Yeah. Because as it is, it's like she could almost have a child with anyone.
That's true, because she's hot.
Like... like it's just, she wants a kid because she wants one. And I'm like, okay, but it's not... Like it's so out of step with the rest of the character that it's not done in a compelling way.
I really loved like in The Last Wish how she was toying with Geralt. Like they were like so flirty with one another. She was like, I'm gonna take a bath and like you stink. And then she turns invisible and like dresses herself. I don't know, is that in the series? No idea. But
honestly I can't remember. There is a lot of sex in the television series. Yeah, it's great. And Geralt has that flirtation with a lot of it. Like the the cursed evil girl that wants to kill the wizard in the Lesser Evil.
The Lesser Evil, yes.
They have a whole flirty thing as well.
Yeah, they do.
So then they're good at the flirtation in the writing. The biggest flaw, I think, with the book, and to be fair to the author, I don't think that he envisaged turning this into a big series. So, like, remember, The Last Wish is a series of short stories, and then it's only later on that he writes novels. And eventually we will read the novels. We'll have some other book episodes in the meantime, but eventually we'll read the novels, and maybe these things are corrected. But the things that took me out of it was that the world building wasn't properly done.
Yeah.
So, for example, we had this debate before.
Basically, right? So one of the lines when they did the big fight in The Last Wish was, I was like, oh, your house is tumbling down. It's like, it's okay. I have insurance. Keep fighting. Like, and I was like, oh, that's funny. And you're like, I hate that scene.
Yes. So it's like, oh, does it cover magical incidents? It's like, of course. And this is like some elf bragging about how he's got full insurance and he's happy that his house is being destroyed by this genie.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so this is a medieval world where they've got insurance. Now, if you think of all the structures that you need for insurance, you need to have like businesses that are able to provide insurance guarantees for a large number of properties, because otherwise it's unprofitable. There has to be promissory notes. There has to be a banking system. There has to be like agreed value and so forth of all these things. You need to have standard weights and measurements for things. All of these kinds of constituent elements are required for something as modern as a housing insurance policy. Okay,
But what is just about destiny?
Yeah, and so it's clearly in there as a joke. But that's the problem with fantasy, where one of the great challenges of fantasy writing is that you have to be able to find a way to ground someone in what's happening. Because if everything becomes new, like suddenly there's insurance, then anything can become a... then anything can become a deus ex machina, that the resolution of a story can be made because, God decided, right?
That's true. It was all a dream.
Exactly. You need to set the reader up to not feel like they're walking on eggshells through the story, that they can actually grasp all the elements of what's happening. And none of that work was done in The Witcher. Now, in some of the stories, it doesn't actually matter because it's on a very constrained level, like these personal interactions. That's fine. Or they have instant setup and payoff, right? So, for example, at the end of the book, and they did this really well, where there are these knights that are trying to run Geralt out of town, and they have this code. The code of the knights is like, people can challenge under these circumstances, but not others. Well, Geralt then uses that same setup and turns it back on the knights. Now, even then they did it wrongly, because my reading of that wasn't quite like Geralt didn't have the right to do that. But at least they did that kind of setup and payoff, right?
Right. They explicitly stated the rules.
Exactly. They stated the constraints of this thing, and Geralt could operate diplomatically within that constraint.
It was just true, I guess, because you have insurance, then you're like, well, where's the money getting kept? Because it seems like The Witcher kind of goes around and be like, I'll get that troll, and it's like, here's some money. It's very old school, hand in hand.
I mean, I can imagine a future in where Geralt makes an alliance with a bunch of monsters, and there's like, all right, I'll pretend to kill you, and you pretend to die, and then I'll pay you some money, and then you go off to the next village and we'll do it again, right? I could see Geralt kind of doing that sort of thing. Whereas maybe not himself, but that being a common...
that would be a common thing, because even Geralt, I don't know, it was in the series, not in the book, but even he was if the fake Witcher, I don't ask for prepayment.
Yes.
Kind of thing. He has honor in some ways, I will do the job properly.
Well, that's another thing I didn't like, actually. So he has a code that he lives by, and this is just a nuanced thing.
Okay.
So he has a code, and one of the things of his code is he doesn't kill intelligent creatures, unless they're attacking him, or So, for example, he kills the elves and the humans that are fighting to kill the guy he's protecting.
Sure.
Right, but he doesn't, as a contract, take money and go and kill like a human, right? And then he says that to the queen. He's like, look, you've got other people to kill your political enemies and things like that. I'm not going to kill some random person because you pay me. That's just not part of the deal. That's not what a witcher does. But then the troll, where he tells the story, and this is what I mentioned much earlier, where the guy on the bridge, well, if he can repair a bridge and charge a toll, then he's an intelligent creature.
That's true.
Right? He's not some monster that's this mindless thing, operating purely on instinct. Mm-hmm. So the witch's code...
But he didn't know that. He didn't know that. He was like, how much for the troll? Because all he saw was, the troll breaking people's bones and, taking advantage of people.
No. He mentioned that they have to pay a toll, and if they don't pay up, then the troll breaks their legs. Right. So there is some kind of financial reward that Geralt was already aware of. Okay.
Right, okay.
And he's also, one of the things you also know about Geralt is that he's super knowledgeable about different monsters and creatures and their strengths and vulnerabilities and where they come from and so on. Yeah. So when he sees all these clues, one of the things that's interesting about Geralt is he's trying to work out what things are.
Yeah.
So in a sort of Sherlock
Holmes
kind of way.
And he thinks of his spell, what was that spell again? This specific creature.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not realistic that he doesn't know a troll is an intelligent creature, right?
Oh, okay.
So there is an aspect of this that doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of world building that I think is necessary for a fantasy series that the author neglects. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a cause and consequence. So, for example, if there was an insurance policy in Game of Thrones, you could absolutely 100% guarantee that George R.R. Martin would have set all that up so that there was no doubt as to why that was. And there is such a thing. There's the Bravosi Bank, and that bank is super powerful and it controls a whole territory, and they bankroll all these conflicts and get involved in Westerosi politics. So the Bank of Bravos is a player in the thing, whereas that happens before the Bank of Bravos actually shows up. You kind of know about this,
right?
Whereas insurance from whom?
Yeah,
How?
I guess you kind of have to use imagination and be like, it's because it's a short story. We don't get the whole world, and there's all these other books we have to read to kind of get more.
Yes, but it shouldn't. It should be set up first, then pay off, not pay off and then it'll be explained later. We get that problem with modern sort of movies as well, the new Star Wars series. So much stuff the First Order just shows up and takes over the galaxy within 30 years of the Empire being destroyed. How does that happen? Maybe it'll be explained later. The Knights of Ren is set up in the first Force Awakens film.
Yeah.
And they're a joke by the end of it. There's all these things that are set up as just explained as part of the normal world, and then they have to find a backfill to kind of... That's not a good way of doing the story. You need to kind of set the scene, and then things happen that flow from that is logical for the reader.
Yeah.
And
man, it really does throw off when you add a joke. He's so funny. You write it insurance policy, and then suddenly you get Crispin on the other line and be like, doesn't make sense.
I despise it. And and this is a problem to a degree with the games as well. The Witcher games. So you've got Novigrad, you've got Skellige, you've got Sincre or whatever it's called, where that queen was. You've got these different political entities.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to get your head around their relationships, why certain groups go to conflict with one another. Whereas in Game of Thrones, they've got so much more. You've got the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, you've got Bravos, which I mentioned, you've got Meereen, you've got the whole Eastern Peninsula, you've got where the Maesters come from, the Old Town, all these different places, Karth, and I can visualize it, exactly where they all are, how it all works, why they have this kind of interrelating history, and it all makes sense. Now, not everyone can be George R.R. Martin, and these books are just nowhere near long enough to do that, but you could do that on a smaller scale.
Yeah, true, because they didn't really explore that. The only time you see the kingdoms together is when they try to marry off the daughter. I mean, what is there anything that really touched on the relationships between all the...
Yeah, and I think we have to be a little bit forgiving of the author with this, because the stories are like fairy tales. You know, the queen sleeping, or the princess sleeping on 23 mattresses and feeling the pee. Well, it doesn't really matter what kingdom she's in. You know, you just kind of like, this is not from The Witcher. This is actual fairy tale. That doesn't matter. What matters is that story.
Yeah.
But as you build on it, and as Geralt goes on these more and more adventures, then the reader does have expectations about, okay, well, what are the limits of the world? When they say they go to the edge of the world, where is that exactly?
Yeah.
Why can't they go further? What happens if they go further? What's stopping them from going further? Like, all these questions are really important. And given that Geralt, his intrinsic motivations aren't clear, which is, I think, another big problem, other than he wants money and likes Yennefer, it's not clear what's making him doing it. Like, why is he going to this place and not that place?
That's true. Because, like, think about it. Well, I mean, they're trained up as witches in a young age. Is it like chemical brain? You know, I think that's all they think about is hunting a monster, or like that's been indoctrinated since young. Like, that is your purpose in life, and nothing else. And perhaps that's the only thing that fulfills them.
Yes. Well, and I can see people who are going to hopefully comment down below and say, oh, look, I've read all the series.
Oh, yeah, please.
And all of these things are fixed. And you know, when Ciri becomes the main driving force and he's like the father figure and he's training her up, maybe that's all explained, like that he gets that purpose. And again, forgiving of the author who probably wrote these short stories not thinking that it would become a big thing, because who does? And then it suddenly becomes a big thing, so he starts writing novels, and you get a sense of all the different characters, you know, Triss Merigold and various others that are mentioned in passing, but then you get their backstories.
Yeah.
So, you know, perhaps that's why. I know when you go online and you go, look, what order do you read these things in? Because there are novels that start up later. Everything online seems to say, you know, start with The Last Wish because it introduces the characters and so forth. But maybe that's not the right way to do it. Maybe people should start with the novels. I don't know. This is not my recommendation. I haven't read the novels. But perhaps if you're a critical reader, like I am, then having that world building, maybe that's done later. And then going back to The Last Wish and reading things in that context makes more sense. I don't know.
Perhaps, because they've been like, he's had time to give thought of how to build the world, and then having read The Last Wish then you're able to see like an overview of the different stories, and all the characters come up, and you're like, oh, that makes sense, or might not, don't know, but okay, great, cool. I rank The Last Wish an 8 out of 10. Like,
I'm gonna give it a 7.
A 7? Okay.
Yeah. It's not low enough to be a 6.5. It's definitely not an 8.
Then not 8. Okay.
For me.
For you, yeah.
But a 7. Like, definitely go read it. It's a fun read. The conversations are really strong. That's probably the best. Like, there's dialogue. And in the television series, I'll finish on this for me. In the television series, Henry Cavill doesn't say much. He's just kind of the brooding type who, you know, swears a lot, right? Whereas in the book, Geralt is much more conversational.
Yeah.
Now, that's probably because he needs to be, but you get a sense of like the interactions. The way he sees the world is really quite sophisticated, and it's probably good just for that perspective. Also, it's really great to see like an author who's like most people in that part of the world talking about the human condition and dealing with serious issues like resentment, like changing world. I think that's really, really good. So yeah, a solid 7, but not an 8.
Not an 8. Yeah, the only reason I rank it an 8 was I really like the fight scenes. I don't know, like reading fight scenes I think is so boring, but like it just got so intense and I just kept reading. I was like, what happens next?
That's a good point.
Like, it's just, it has enough detail to give you context and then imagine it in your head. And then obviously series execute it way more because they have all theatrics, but to actually execute that in a book, I think is quite impressive. And yeah, I mean, I know the jokes are kind of out of context, but I really enjoyed them. I loved how each short story wrapped up with like a message at the end. It's like, oh, there's sometimes truth in fairy tales when the monster turns human again, or yeah, like there's certain like nicks at the end, or like, you know, how, you know, the law of surprise ends up with the child of his own. Like, he just like, he rounds off his stories quite well. You're like, oh, like again, like a fairy tale. Like, oh, there's like a
I will say this: if I had a teenager, I'd let them read The Witcher. You know, even though there is like things in it that are pretty heavy, I think that it does have that kind of exciting, gripping kind of read that you want kids to get interested in reading to do. So it has that. But as an adult, it's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. You're so popular. Anyways.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, we've got some beeping in the background.
That's not your computer, guys, at home. That's mine.
Yeah. So that's all the time we have for today. Any questions, any comments, feedback, leave them down below. We're experimenting here. Hopefully you enjoyed this book review.
If you have any suggestions also for books.
Good point. Yeah.
Baltic world. So anything from any literature from the Baltic region, preferably fiction. So there are like authors that are just amazing, but are not really fiction. So Svetlana Alexeyevich from Belarus, for example, Nobel Prize winning literature, Voices from Chernobyl. Like that's amazing. Maybe we will cover that in the future. But for now, literature that's fiction, kind of novels, or something like this, a series of short stories. Give out your recommendations down below in terms of what you would like to see us review in the book series.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, sounds good. Stay safe and
ciao for now.